Good morning, and welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Vice Chairman Bella Dinzar, and it's my privilege to chair this meeting of the NTSB. Today, we meet in open session, as required by the Government in the Sunshine Act, to consider a fatal runway overrun during a rejected takeoff at Lawrence G. Hanscom Field in Bedford, Massachusetts on May 31st, 2014. The accident involved a Gulfstream G4. The privately owned and operated business jet rolled beyond the paved overrun area and subsequently crashed into a ravine where a post-impact fire ensued. Tragically, the two pilots, the flight attendant, and all 4 passengers on board died. In a moment, staff will present the facts and analysis of the accident. Much of this investigation centered on a mechanism called a gust lock. But as this flight crew prepared for takeoff, the gust lock remained engaged. Simply put, an airplane cannot take off safely with the gust lock engaged. As our investigators examined the data about this accident flight, they found that the flight crew routinely neglected performing complete flight control checks. These checks would have identified that the gust lock was still engaged before taxiing the aircraft for takeoff. Each of the 2 pilots involved in this accident had thousands of hours of flying time. Their training and medical certificates were current. They had flown together for years as pilots on the accident airplane.
Good morning, Vice Chairman Dinzar, Member Sumwalt, and Member Weiner. On May 31st, 2014, about 21:40 local time, a Gulfstream Aerospace Corporation G4, owned by SK Travel LLC and operated by Arizon Ventures LLC as a Part 91 corporate flight, crashed after it overran the end of runway 11 during a rejected takeoff at Lawrence G. Hanscom Field in Bedford, Massachusetts. The 2 pilots, a flight attendant, and 4 passengers were fatally injured. Night visual meteorological conditions prevailed at the time of the accident. The airplane arrived at Bedford about 15:45. After landing, the flight crew engaged the gust lock system, which locks the airplane's primary flight control surfaces to protect them from wind gusts while parked. The passengers left the airport while the flight crew remained with the airplane. The passengers returned about 6 hours later for a return flight to Atlantic City, New Jersey. The flight crew did not disengage the airplane's gust lock prior to engine start. The gust lock system includes a mechanical interlock that was intended to restrict the movement of the throttle levers when the gust lock was engaged to prevent an unsafe takeoff. Staff's investigation found that the throttle lever movement allowed by the interlock on the accident airplane was 3 to 4 times the design intent. During the 11 minutes from the time that the passengers boarded the airplane to the time that the airplane reached the runway, the pilots made no mention of checklists or takeoff planning. The pilots also did not perform a flight control check before the takeoff attempt, which would have alerted them of the engaged gust lock. Analysis of data from the airplane's quick access recorder revealed that the accident pilots neglected to perform a complete flight control check during about 98% of their previous 175 flights. An animation of the accident was created using information from the airplane's cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. The animation begins with the airplane, which is shown 3 times larger than the scale of the animation, taxiing onto the runway in preparation for takeoff. At this time, if you do not wish to view the animation, you may exit the boardroom, and those watching by webcast may wish to temporarily turn away from their display. Please play the animation. The animation does not depict the night lighting conditions that existed at the time of the accident. Certain system parameters or settings are shown, but these displays are not intended to mimic the actual displays in the cockpit. Selected comments from the CVR transcript attributed to the pilot in command, PIC, and second in command, SIC, appear as text at the time indicated in the transcript on the left side of the display area. Based on a review of previous takeoff attempts, the flight crew likely targeted an engine pressure ratio setting, or EPR, of 1.7, which is shown with a green horizontal bar. In addition, there are indications for activation of the autothrottle, flight power shutoff valve handle, or FPSOV, brakes, and thrust reversers. The animation is first shown at 1/3 speed and then plays again at actual speed. The animation begins as the airplane turns from the taxiway onto the runway. While taxiing onto the runway, the flight crew discussed the activation of the rudder limit light. These comments indicated that they had observed a blue rudder limit advisory message consistent with rudder movement with the gust lock still engaged. With the gust lock engaged, the throttle levers should have been restricted from providing an engine pressure ratio capable of enabling the airplane to reach takeoff speed. However, in this case, the gust lock system did not limit the motion of the throttle sufficiently to prevent an unsafe takeoff. The brakes were released and the throttles were advanced manually until they reached a restriction corresponding to an engine pressure ratio of about 1.4. This setting was substantially less than the normal target engine pressure ratio of 1.7 typically used by the pilots. The auto throttles were engaged and engine pressure ratios began to increase towards their maximum attained value of about 1.6 before reducing to about 1.5. As the engine pressure ratios reduced, the pilot in command commented couldn't get it manually any further, which suggests that he was aware of the restriction in the throttle lever movement. The second in command called out that the airplane had reached a speed of 80 knots. About 6 seconds later, the second in command indicated the airplane had reached takeoff decision speed, V1. The second in command then called rotate. 1 second later, the pilot in command said steer lock is on. The pilot in command repeated this statement 6 times during the next 12.7 seconds. About 7 seconds after the rotate call, one of the pilots activated the flight power shutoff valve, which removed the hydraulic pressure from the primary flight controls and ground spoilers, likely in an attempt to release the gust lock. About 11 seconds after the rotate call, brake pressure started to rise. This occurred at a ground speed of about 162 knots and with about 1,400 feet of runway remaining. 4 seconds later, the throttle levers were pulled back and the pilot in command said, "I can't stop it." The airplane exited the runway onto the paved overrun and the thrust reversers were deployed. The airplane exited the paved overrun onto the grass, traveling about 105 knots. The sound of an impact was recorded about 1 second later at a ground speed of about 97 knots, followed by the end of recorded data. The airplane collided with runway lighting and a localizer antenna and passed through the airport's perimeter fence before coming to rest in a ravine formed by the Shawsheen River. The main wreckage came to rest about 850 feet past the end of the paved runway overrun and was destroyed by a post-crash fire. The arrow on this slide shows the point on the runway during the takeoff attempt where an overrun beyond the paved surface was inevitable. Performance calculations indicated that if the rejected takeoff procedures outlined in the airplane flight manual had been applied up to about 11 seconds after the first lock is on comment, the airplane could have stopped on the paved surface. The impact forces in the accident were survivable, but the cabin and cockpit environment quickly deteriorated due to the post-crash fire, which erupted immediately and prevented the occupants from escaping.
Good morning. The flight crew involved in this accident was properly certificated and fit for duty. The pilots were also highly experienced. The pilot in command had more than 11,000 flight hours and more than 1,600 hours in the G4. The second in command had more than 18,000 flight hours with more than 3,000 hours in the G4. The two pilots had been flying together at SK Travel for about 12 years, 7 of which they spent flying the accident airplane. Despite their experience, the pilots made 2 key errors. They neglected to release and stow the gust lock, and they neglected to perform a flight control check. The flight crew's neglecting to release the gust lock was an unintentional error of omission. This is a common form of error, and similar errors involving the omission of normal procedural steps have played a role in about 20% of flight crew-involved major accidents. Checklists are an important defense against such errors. Cockpit voice recordings indicated that the flight crew did not call for any checklists or verbalize any checklist items during the attempted takeoff. A pilot who had previously flown with the PIC said this was typical for him because he had memorized the G4 checklist. However, executing checklists silently and from memory removes many benefits and increases susceptibility to error.